Great. Well, welcome everyone to the Meet the Authors event of the Social Innovations Journal. We're ecstatic to have partnered with Ownership Capital Lab and Social Impact Commons. The irony of this story is like Allison and Thaddeus and I were at the same conference about a year, just about a year ago, the Impact PHL conference, and we started discussing sort of the innovations and the purpose of the journal. And so that was the idea that launched this edition, and here we are, almost a year later, to really take your knowledge and share it with the world. And next slide. So we basically, in the Meet the Authors event, is really a chance for us to capture the voices of the authors themselves. So the articles are one thing, and we encourage all the readers to read them. But by having these videos also, it's like the readership has a chance to see your face, listen to you, and really understand sort of the thinking behind the authors. What we're going to cover today, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the journal if you're not familiar with it, and then we're going to turn it over to our two co-curators for the fiscal sponsorship and then the employee ownership, where you get to hear the authors themselves, and then you'll get to meet with them more interactively in a breakout groups. So just a little background on the journal. We started this, the journal was, the catalyst for the journal was back in about 2009 or 2008. I was an Eisenhower Fellow and with another Eisenhower Fellow, and we realized there wasn't really a place for social sector people to come together and say, how do we share our secrets? And the replication and scaling does not necessarily work as it does in the private sector. So we thought the journal would be a good place for that. It's a little unique from like Stanford Social Innovations Review, only because they have in-depth articles. This is really framed with a idea for practitioners to come to the table, talk about their work in their own ecosystem, publish it, and therefore others can then take that knowledge and information and then adopt it and then implement it locally. Next slide. So we do 6 editions annually. We do have themes, so we try to focus on education, human services, social mobility, and health sort of themes. We're not exclusive to do that, but within each theme, they're framed within the idea of our title, social innovation, social enterprise, meaning like you're looking at earned income models, system change policy, and collaborations. Down below, you look at our some of our traditional curation partners from Ashoka, which is global. Tamarack Institute. We have a great global network of transformation communities, the networks towards unity for health, which is global health, Wood System of Care, which is human services, and Atmashaki Trust. So we're excited to add these two. Maybe we'll do another edition, but we'll get through this edition first. Next slide. The journal is also an open access, so anybody can submit articles, although we do try to, anybody that submits an article to us, is we try to put it within the theme-based editions, as we do theme-based editions with the idea that we concentrate a lot of resources in one place. Next slide. And with that, if you have any questions or like to submit, the journal's online, but you can reach myself, Nick Torres, and the co-founder publisher, or Nikolai that sort of manages the Meet the Authors events. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Thaddeus for fiscal sponsorship. Thaddeus.
Hi, yes, pleasure to be here. Thanks, Nick, for the intro and for the opportunity to collaborate on this series. Just in a nutshell, we have been developing at Impact Commons really a vision for the field of fiscal sponsorship that's shifting the narrative from what its I would say its historical perception or the dominant perception has been, namely that it's a kind of marginal workaround for nonprofits on their way to their own standalone status or temporary projects and the like. We really see the tremendous potential that one of the models, comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, holds, namely as a significant alternative infrastructure for the nonprofit sector, full stop. The ability to essentially co-house multiple independent nonprofit initiatives under one umbrella, sort of like a holding company. And that model, it's called Model A, or Comprehensive Fiscal Sponsorship, has been around since the beginning of the field and has been used that way quite a bit over the last 60 years. The field dates to the 50s. And though it's still not necessarily embraced for that use in that manner fully, or seen by the general public and social entrepreneurs as an option. And so we're really trying to lift that idea up, that you don't have to have standalone nonprofit infrastructure to support a plurality of mission and vision and agency out there, that we can share more of that back end infrastructure and thereby achieve lots of economies of scale, be more efficient with resources, create situations and context for solidarity and collective action, and a lot of other benefits. And so stepping one position back from that, kind of more local, how it works on the ground view, we really see the fiscal sponsor ecosystem growing, not by necessarily the creation of larger kind of national, multinational fiscal sponsors in the sort of corporate manner, but really the proliferation of fiscal sponsors all across the landscape. So we really want to see more and better, particularly comprehensive fiscal sponsors operating out there, and ones that are organized indeed around certain mission and impact areas like environment, health and human services, et cetera. Geographic catchment, which is the way a lot of the community currently organizes itself, as well as identity groups. So there are fiscal sponsors emerging that support, BIPOC women, social entrepreneurs, for example, or environmental justice organizations in the greater Seattle region, for example. So we're really seeing these as powerful vehicles for collective action, but operating really at a local level and leveraging that close relationship between the shared infrastructure and the communities that it supports, that sort of essential touch that's needed to sustain and build trust. So, we see a nonprofit sector that's 1.9 million nonprofits and counting, 97% of which operate below a half million, 5 million in budget. And we see a real challenge in capacitating all of that, unless we really think differently about the underlying infrastructure and the model. And so that's been our vision from the inception. That vision remains the same today, but with, I would say, even greater urgency given the current stresses on the sector by the present administration. We really see fiscal sponsorship as a safe harbor and a tool to a bit of a bulwark, if you will, to preserve the civil society functions that our communities really need, particularly at this time of a lot of trial and a lot of challenge. So I'll kind of leave it there as a summary. The things that we posted and contributed cover a lot of these ideas and bases, and I'll hand it back to Nick.
Well, I think Thaddeus, you're going to introduce each of your authors for them to give a
Oh yeah,
brief overview of their piece.
yeah. We don't have. I think Rhea was having a little trouble getting on. I don't know if she's gotten on in the meantime.
I'm here, thank you.
Oh, you're okay. Great. All right. So with us we have well, Rhea, since you're there, why don't we start with you if you want to introduce yourself and talk about what you contributed, and then we can pass it on to the others who are here.
Hello, thank you, Thaddeus, for the invitation, and Nicholas and the team for hosting us. My name is Rhea. I use she or they. I live in Philadelphia, and I recently completed some research for Inter Alia, which is a new fiscal host based in Germany. They were curious about what feminist fiscal sponsorship might look like. So that report is coming out, and I had the opportunity to speak with Thaddeus as I was putting that research together. And the submission that is in the special issue takes one of those central arguments from that piece, which is that, the impact of fiscal sponsorship on social justice movements might be found in the how as opposed to the what of fiscal sponsorship. There's a lot been made of like these 6 models of what fiscal sponsorship is, A through L. I think there's still a lot of, because of the general accounting and operational literacy across the field, there's a kind of like fiscal sponsorship is this kind of mystery thing. But I think when we talk to fiscal hosts who have been doing it for a while, the practice of sponsorship is um, solvable. Like these are problems that people solve. Like if you know your accounting, you know your infrastructure, you can solve the fiscal sponsorship problems, like technically. The place where there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be developed, in my opinion, is about it has to do with how the relationships are fomented between the hosts and the projects, how they're invited into relation with each other. We're hearing a lot of frustration from workers at fiscal sponsors about the transactional nature of fiscal sponsorship work. It feels transactional, right? Which gives this feeling to people at fiscal hosts that they're um, the same frustrations with all sorts of feminized labor, right? That we're just providing services, and it keeps them away from this other kind of imaginative political visioning for what fiscal sponsorship could be, as Thaddeus and the Social Impact Commons have been pushing for some time, that it could be a place to imagine commoning infrastructure, commoning resources, inviting each other into relation otherwise, and as such could be like a very important practice space for, the movement space as a whole, right? Like how do we change the way that we survive, right? Like because there's not much in this system that is survivable or salvageable. So in this way, if we think about fiscal sponsorship, if we think about the how of it, if we think about the social infrastructure of fiscal sponsorship, if we think about the relationships, how are we designing those relationships? I think that that's like a very open and fertile and powerful place to think about what fiscal sponsorship could be. And so I tried to collect some of those thoughts in the piece that I submitted.
Thanks. Anahi?
Hi, my name is Anaí. I'm here on behalf of ACER, and very happy and grateful to be part of this. And I'm very curious I already hear a lot of connections with the other work. So our focus for our submission was, we've been always interested in thinking about collective action. Now, how does that work and how do you organize it in the context of Puerto Rico in particular, where you have so many neighborhood-based organizations, so many nonprofit organizations without tax-exempt status, and plus in Puerto Rico you have to think about the local tax exemption and the federal tax exemption, and how everything around us it's sort of pushing us towards organizing and the communities to solve their own problems, and yet the main tool to do it is the nonprofit framework. It fails them oftentimes and creates additional barriers, right? And so we've noticed that the communities know what they need. They have solutions. They risk a lot to do it, but they just need some support. And another thing that we've been thinking a lot is, the resources are limited, so we shouldn't be competing for those resources. How do we build a shared infrastructure that can support a bunch of groups that are doing the work that we think it's needed in terms of, equity and quality of life in Puerto Rico? And so our piece was really about sort of the evolution of that, of seeing a need, trying to figure out how to organize collective action, but then having to respond to emergencies. ACER was created before Hurricanes Maria and Irma, but we were right in that process. We were kind of defining what does fiscal sponsorship look like in Puerto Rico, and what kind of organization we were building, and what were our strategies. And all of a sudden it's like we had to act, and there were donors who wanted to give money, but they couldn't do it because of the tax regulations, and communities that needed funding, and we had to jump in but at the same time, we had to do it in a way that it was consistent with our mission, and that really helped us build something long-term in terms of the vision. And that idea has evolved into a network of actions where we're working with different community groups, and also with the idea of a platform of shared resources that has been mostly operational or administrative and accounting and strategic, but now it's turning into more sort of concrete piece in a shared building that we have just recently acquired, in collaboration with other organizations, partners, but also members of our network, which we hope will be like the place where we can try out everything, all of the ideas that we have around what does it mean to share resources, but also responsibilities and risks, in trying to build movements and collective actions where everybody can have we're all interdependent, right? We need each other, we support each other, but we can just follow the path that we need in order to achieve our goals. So that's pretty much our piece.
Great, thanks. And I guess finally, Josh Sadley is here with us on the call. We don't have either the two authors for Healthy Places by Design, but at least I don't believe we do. I'm looking at the list here. But Josh has been working with and a former board member of Healthy Places, and can talk about the sort of forever home angle and view. Josh?
Yeah, thank you, Thaddeus. And I'm a colleague of Thaddeus's at Social Impact Commons. But prior to that, I was legal counsel at a fiscal sponsor that currently plays host to Healthy Places by Design. Healthy Places thought piece here, it really is on kind of shifting the mental model that Thaddeus talked about earlier, from fiscal sponsorship being a valuable tool as an incubator or a stop on the way to full independence and being a standalone nonprofit. Healthy Places by Design, just for background, they were a program at UNC Chapel Hill for about 10 or so years, funded by one large national funder. And they eventually outgrew that relationship, and they went through a strategic process to decide, okay, do we go out, become an independent 501c3, or do we find a fiscal sponsor where we can, get turnkey access to all that back office infrastructure at a good price point? At the time they were looking at, short, medium term, maybe 2 or 3 years, while they got their ducks in a row, because their mental model at the time was, and then we're going to become independent. So they transitioned into that comprehensive fiscal sponsor, and they have a governance structure as an advisory board, which many fiscally sponsored projects have. They're not the fiduciary board because that sits at the fiscal sponsors level. However, they're there to provide strategic guidance and support to the director. And they would continually periodically, typically annually, evaluate the fiscal sponsor relationship, and with the idea like, let's make an informed decision whether it makes sense to become independent or continue on with this relationship, because per the fiscal sponsorship agreement, they have that agency and ability to exit the relationship and compel the transfer out of all the assets into a separate entity. And they would, again, routinely go through this process, and although they would hear periodic pressure from maybe a advisory board member or a funder say, hey, why don't you, grow up and, be independent, you could do so much more of your independent. When they actually asked the why behind that, maybe 4 or 5 times, the ultimate answer was, well, you could actually do everything you want to do under this fiscal sponsor umbrella, and do so at a more cost-effective way with a values-aligned partner. And through this model, the director, Risa, she's able to focus on strategy, managing her team, raising resources, but she doesn't have to be worrying about the audit, the 990, developing and updating personnel policies, procuring liability insurance, because that's all seen by the trusted partner, their fiscal sponsor, basically handling all the stuff that, while core to their critical to their existence is really far removed from their passions and competencies. And so that's my quick spiel on why they've chosen to be with a fiscal sponsor for the long term. And we are seeing this more and more as a trend. Projects will stay with fiscal sponsors, not just for a year, but for decades. That doesn't mean there aren't use cases where it makes sense to spin out and be entirely independent and important to the relationship. Each project has that authority to exit the relationship, but we're seeing it happen less and less as especially with strong fiscal sponsors that are able to provide those responsive supports in a really, way that focuses on the needs of the projects they exist to serve.
Thanks, Josh. Nick, how are we on time? I mean, I can say a few things about my piece, or we can
I think you
move on.
should. Yeah.
Okay.
Thaddeus said, yeah, you should talk about your article. Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so picking up on what the broad introduction I offered a few minutes ago, the piece I contributed is really on the rise of what we are terming, and this is a coinage of Impact Commons, Management Commons, which is a kind of 2.0 reinvention of that comprehensive fiscal sponsorship form I mentioned. And in the comprehensive fiscal sponsorship model, essentially the project or the operating unit becomes a program under the sponsored charity. So it behaves almost like a garden variety program, except that it retains its identity, its ability to exit, all the things that Josh mentioned. And as such, the sponsor becomes essentially a cooperativized backbone, nonprofit backbone for up to potentially hundreds of projects. There are sponsors with very large portfolios, hundreds, some in the thousands, that operate under one EIN. And that's kind of where the magic happens. We have been evolving the practice of fiscal sponsorship based in commoning and common pool resource work. This is an entire field very close to cooperative work. But it has its own kind of theory and kind of political philosophy underpinnings. But commoning holds kind of three, among its tenets are three ones that we're kind of really picking up. One is being really clear about the resources that are being cooperativized or shared. So being very transparent, very clear about what's being shared and what the rules are, how it's being shared and operationalized. To kind of Rhea's point earlier, some fiscal sponsors are not as clear as they need to be about that. So we kind of, that's one tenet that's important. The second is really a commitment to intentional community building. So not seeing the sponsorship relationship as transactional and one way, but seeing it really as a kind of relationship of mutual care. Mutuality is central to kind of the commoning perspective. And in that, being very clear about what are the boundaries and values and things that define that community. As I mentioned, sponsors are growing up around particular identity groups and definable communities. The third tenet, which in many ways is perhaps most critical in this day and age, is peer governance, a commitment to the governing group of the sponsor having significant voice from the project. So those that benefit from the commons resource need to govern the commons resource. That's a tenet of commoning. And so we've sort of taken those three ideas and said, what if we applied those values as concepts to the sort of historic comprehensive model A model? When you do that, you get management commons. So that's a vision for that particular part of the field's practice that we are holding up. The broader context for that is my sense and hypothesis that the nonprofit sector today is really the latter day vestige of the commons sector, which existed, in Western law close to 1,000 years ago and persisted for several hundred years. We've lost it in most modern legal contexts, but commoning was seen as a public asset that was neither the state nor private. So if that sounds familiar, it should. The nonprofit third sector is the independent sector, is a sector that governs public trust assets that are neither government owned nor privately owned. They are public trust. They are, in a sense, the property of the people and benefit the general public. And in that way, we see the nonprofit sector as intrinsically commons oriented. And so fiscal sponsorship and this, particularly the comprehensive model, are kind of native constructs. And we just want to lift that up to say that this is actually the most coherent way to manage these assets in our sector, as opposed to the kind of dominant model we have now that everybody goes out and forms their own company. That model, I would argue, is a vestige of private sector management practices that have been inappropriately co-opted into what is a very different sector with very different assets that require very different approaches to how we steward them and how we wield them for public good. So the article deals with sort of this vision or this history and positioning of the nonprofit sector as a commons sector more than a nonprofit sector, and position sort of fiscal sponsorship and this comprehensive form as kind of the intrinsic way you would organize such a sector if you subscribe to that framework. So that was my contribution, and very much an underpinning of our practice and what we advocate for in the field.
Great. Well, thank you, Thaddeus, and authors, and you'll get a chance to meet them and have more of a Q&A and conversation with them in the breakout groups. But again, a great trend in the nonprofit. It comes up all the time in terms of should we incorporate, should we not incorporate, and the fiscal sponsorship is a business viable option for them. So thank you for your contributions to that. With that, I'll turn it over to Allison to talk about trends in employee ownership, which is also a fascinating topic of my own. So Allison?
Yeah, thank you so much. And, Thaddeus, I will say that I'm a huge fan of fiscal sponsorship, since both my current organization is fiscally sponsored and my previous organization, we were fiscally sponsored for more than 10 years by Multiplier, a wonderful, wonderful fiscal sponsor. Can't say enough good things about them. And my current fiscal sponsor is The Impact, which is also a great organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ownership and employee ownership. And we've got a great group of folks here, wonderful set of articles to be talking about different organizations that are in the nonprofit and the sort of nonprofit philanthropic space in employee ownership. There are also a number of wonderful organizations that are in the for-profit space in employee ownership. So this is one of those areas that spans kind of the whole set of sectors. And I want to just start with asking each of you to think about something for a little bit. If you can think about ownership. So what does that word mean to you? And how has ownership affected you in your own life? Whether you are an owner of something or whether you wish you were an owner of something, whether you have owned something for a long period of time or are hoping to become an owner. For many people, you'd start small, and maybe you become an owner in a business, maybe you become a homeowner, maybe you own a vehicle. But what does that word ownership actually mean to you? And how has it affected you to be an owner? So this is what we're really talking about, how ownership can change people's lives and people's life trajectories in really meaningful way. It can create stability, can create choice for individuals, for families. It can create the opportunity really to be in charge of your own future in what can be pretty impactful ways. So employee ownership is when you have the full base, so broad-based ownership, a full base of the workers in a business who own that business together. And there's a lot of different ways that that can show up, and you'll hear about probably some worker cooperatives from some of our authors. You might hear the term employee stock ownership plan. You might hear employee ownership trust. Don't worry about the fact that there's different ways to accomplish it. What you want to take away is that this is a business model where you've got a broad base of owners, which means you have the opposite of wealth concentration. It typically means you're going to have a more diverse set of owners in those businesses. And what it delivers from the employee perspective is it's the benefit of shared entrepreneurship. So we talk so much about entrepreneurship is the path for people to create stability in their lives and opportunity. Well, this is a shared entrepreneurship approach that can do that for each of the individual employees in the workplace. So it is market-based, it's research-backed, and it addresses our country's racial and wealth gaps. And there are reams of data, and we're going to hear, I hope, a story or two from some of our authors, reams of data that demonstrate really the benefits to not only the workers, but also the businesses themselves and the local economies more broadly. In our current political environment, it is a model that has strong bipartisan support. So in the nearly 15 years that I've been in the employee ownership space, every single piece of legislation that has come up in whether the state legislature or the federal legislation has gotten unanimous support. So everyone loves employee ownership. And so the question in front of us is, how do we in the nonprofit sector really lean into it and help it grow and help it become something that is much more normal and much more self-generating, given all of the benefits? So with that, I'm going to I'm going to introduce first Julian McKinley, who is here as the co-executive director at the Democracy at Work Institute. And Julian, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about your organization and what your article is all about.
Thanks so much, Allison. It's great to be here. Thank you all for allowing us to share this work. So as Allison mentioned, I'm from Democracy at Work Institute, and we're a national think and do tank that really focuses on expanding the worker cooperative model specifically to create a lot of the benefits that Allison mentioned, specifically meeting the needs of workers who we describe as being locked out of business ownership opportunities and good jobs. So we generally do this work through research, through business innovation, education, and policy support. But I think most relevant to this conversation, throughout the 10-year history of our organization, we've worked closely with municipalities and community organizations across the country to inform the strategic use of worker ownership. And we specifically promote worker ownership as a tool to address social and economic challenges that are faced by communities and their workers. It could be to preserve legacy businesses, it could be to improve job quality or create wealth building and economic stability opportunities that would otherwise just not be available. And so our article, Catalyzing Worker Cooperative Ecosystem Development, takes the approach of sharing some of our learnings over the past decade about what it means to build successful ecosystems of worker cooperative development. We share successes, some learnings, and a general guidance on how to get started. We know that worker cooperatives and the individuals who work in them really thrive within supportive ecosystems. It's not something that is completely foreign if you think about what does business success look like, particularly at the small business level, right? Our small businesses, conventional small businesses, are usually surrounded by opportunities and supports for them to really have their businesses grounded in local communities and continue to provide critical services. And worker cooperatives really require the same thing. It might look a little bit different, but require the same types of support. And so when we're thinking about building an ecosystem, we're talking about coordinating the individual actors, the organizations and institutions that support their success. That might include providing financing. It could be cooperative development specifically, providing training for workers. And so our article goes through the importance of all those different elements. It also presents sort of a shorthand approach to thinking about what ecosystem development could look like in three parts. And those areas are Just to give you a really quick snippet. So number one is leveraging the existing infrastructure. So how do we get worker ownership to operate within the things that are already happening in a community? Already, for example, the business service providers who are already engaging every day with business owners, how do we get them to understand worker ownership and support those businesses on the ground? Can we embrace innovation within our ecosystem? So it takes a little bit of risk taking for us to be able to start something new and support businesses that may look a little bit different than the conventional form. And then generally building awareness and capacity. We know that one of the largest hurdles with respect to the growth of employee ownership is just lack of awareness. These businesses are successful. They create great opportunities, not just on the business side, but for the owners themselves. But many folks just do not know that they exist. And so that local awareness building and capacity building is a huge effort and critically important to building a successful ecosystem. We're excited to talk about it today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julian. Yeah, so really encourage you to read the article about Democracy at Work Institute. And now we're going to shift over and hear from Micha Josephi, who's the executive director of the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast, which is a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution. And we'll let Micha explain all about it. Over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Allison. It's really great to be here with all of you. Like Allison said, I'm Micha Josephi, Executive Director of the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast. We're also known as CFNE. I first connected with CFNE about 20 years ago as a borrower. So I was helping to develop a housing co-op in Boston and needed financing. And like over 140 co-ops today, CFNE's familiarity with the co-op model made them a really wonderful financing partner for the co-op that I was developing. So the article really talks about, who is CFNE and what is our work. So I'll just, talk for a couple minutes here to summarize some of the key points. CFNE is a 50-year-old community loan fund. We were founded because community-owned grocery stores, known as food co-ops, back in the 70s, just like a lot of small business co-ops today, couldn't access conventional financing. Conventional bank financing really assumes a sole proprietor or family ownership model based on personal guarantees, and that really goes against the user patronage essence of cooperatives. And conventional private equity expects high returns and aspects of control that really go against the democratic essence of cooperatives. So these co-ops were really blocked from accessing the critical capital that they needed to start up and grow. And so as a result, the co-op leaders worked with the Haymarket People's Fund, which is a regional foundation based in Boston, to form CFNE. Well, our roots are in food co-ops. Now over 35% of our $48 million loan portfolio is invested in employee-owned worker co-ops. So that means that worker co-ops are the largest sector in our portfolio. CFNE is one of over 1,000 community development financial institutions in the country. Those are called CDFIs. CDFIs have a superpower in that they were created and certified by the US Treasury to drive capital where conventional markets fear to trend. So this can include communities excluded from opportunity due to their rural character, their racial demographics, disability characteristics, and more. CFNE is unusual among CDFIs, but not unique for a number of reasons. First and foremost, we're really focused on cooperatives. And our three main co-op sectors are worker co-ops, food co-ops, and a range of different types of housing co-op models. The second is that we raise most of our loan capital from hundreds of individual investors, as well as a smaller number of institutional investors. So these investors invest between $1,000 and $2 million because they believe in the power of community-controlled cooperatives. And this deep values alignment gives us a resiliency that provides some protection from changes in public policy or federal interest rates in a way that other CDFIs that are more reliant on bank or government funding lack. And finally, and this touches a bit on what Julian was just talking about, we collaborate a bunch with Democracy at Work Institute. We're really focused on ecosystem building. We recognize that there are not a lot of co-ops out there. And for us to achieve our mission and our vision, we need partners to help promote, develop, and support communities building cooperatives. So our paper highlights a couple of exciting ecosystem partnerships that we're involved in. One is the Co-op Navigators Fellowship, which is working to build the next generation of co-op developers, particularly in communities of color. The other is the Northeast Transition Initiative, which exists to increase the demand for and supply of exit planning and employee ownership expertise and services in our region. So finally, I'll just close kind of where I started, that we're 50 years old this year, which is really exciting. We're going to be celebrating this anniversary throughout the year, kicking it off with a virtual event next week, and then some in-person events within the Northeast. So if you're interested in learning more, I'm going to put my email, the registration link for the virtual event, as well as a link to sign up for our newsletter in the chat now. And I'm looking forward to talking to you all in the breakout.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Mika. 50 years, that's a lot to celebrate. A lot of dollars going to cooperatives, including worker cooperatives, which is the employee ownership form of co-ops over that time period. So you've just heard about an organization that's using loan capital to finance the growth of employee ownership, paired with some smart technical assistance, with a regional focus in the northeastern part of the United States. And now we're going to hear from Evergreen Cooperatives that also uses a combination of capital and technical assistance to grow employee ownership, but focused with a more narrowly focused place-based geography in Cleveland, Ohio. So Emma, over to you. Please introduce yourself and tell us more about your article.
Thanks, Allison, for having me. My name is Emma. I have been with Evergreen since 2019, and I co-authored this with my boss, Jeanette Webster, who is the CIO and the CFO here at Evergreen. We are a worker-owned cooperative network of worker-owned cooperatives. We are really proud that we originally started as an anchor institution based worker-owned model. We started with certain anchor institutions within the local Cleveland community, including the local hospitals and local schools and education systems. And we started a couple of startups that helped with the supply chain in that for those type of institutions. One being our cooperative laundry, which we do all of the laundry for the Cleveland Clinic hospital systems and surrounding. In 2019, we started to shift our focus a little bit from more of that anchor institution model and moved it into converting current and local community businesses in low to moderate income neighborhoods. Our goal is always to build and keep a business local and hire within the community that it serves. So a lot of our employees are all located in LMI neighborhoods and communities. In 2019, we began, and currently we are now a self-sustaining loan fund. We have made 6 conversions since 2019. We had 1 add-on acquisition, so we currently have 5 businesses. We are kind of industry agnostic, but I think Jeanette likes to favor some of those manufacturing businesses. But we have about 300 employees with about 200 employee owners. All of our cooperatives are 80% majority owned and democratically operated by their employees. This means that they make larger, more important decisions as a group. They serve on the board, they serve as cooperative members, and then typically they will share in larger decision making. The main idea of our worker-owned cooperatives is more of a wealth building initiative. We are really proud that about on average, we have about 10 grand in annual patronage that we give to each of our employees. And that continues to grow as our businesses continue to grow and succeed. Our article talks a little bit about how all of the work that we've done with our worker-owned network is really focusing on community impact and social impact. And we have found that as we were searching for other capital and growing our fund, there's not a lot of impact data that showcases what the work that we do and how it impacts our not only our employees but also our local community. So our article focuses a lot on the impact that we are making from defining a quality job or a good job into a quality job. So expanding some of those definitions to include economic stability, economic mobility, economic inclusion, and generational wealth. And with that, we are trying to work with some data metrics and developing a system that kind of showcases our impact. So we're working with a lot of local groups and partners that are working with us in our network because we have a unique opportunity to have direct access to their data since we have about 300 employees and 200 employee owners to see the impact on employee ownership in our community and within our employee owners. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emma. So I don't know if you all caught that, but she said $10,000 checks going to each of the employee owners across all of their businesses. So wouldn't you all love to get a $10,000 check in addition to your pay? Now, if you are a frontline worker earning a low wage, that $10,000 check can really be huge. So one of the benefits, one of the many benefits of employee ownership. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to move to hear from an organization that is focusing not at the regional level and not at the city level, metro level, but instead at the state level. So to encourage and support the growth of employee ownership across the entire state of Washington. And we have Alex Spalding from the Whatcom Community Foundation, who has really been the driving force behind getting this new state center for employee ownership stood up. And she's going to talk a little bit about their work, and hoping you'll also talk about the importance of the center being located in a rural part of the state, but serving the entire state. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here. And I want to also just say up front, my colleague who also helped co-write this is on the call, Patricia Kwan. And so I invite you, Patricia, to contribute if I leave something out later. So like Allison said, I'm with the Whatcom Community Foundation in Washington State. The Community Foundation in our county is located at the far northwest corner of the contiguous United States. We're right up against the Canadian border. We are a predominantly rural county with a technically small city of just under 100,000 folks with a university. If you're not familiar with community foundations, they are, for the community. Our vision is that everyone in Whatcom County has an opportunity to thrive, and we are spending a lot more effort leaning into inclusive economies work in a variety of different ways, and employee ownership is a really important component of that. Our organization, our article speaks to sort of our journey around some of this, and we started working and learning about this before COVID, working with the Democracy Collaborative and then Project Equity, and Allison was, her role there was critical to our learning and then sharing awareness in our community. And the journey's in the article, but where we're at now is that a couple of years ago, we were looking with an advisory group and thinking about how do we create the statewide center that, raises awareness. A lot of, as others have spoken about, the issue. One of the many, barriers to this is that people just don't know about it as an opportunity. And then there's data that, we have all these businesses with aging owners, and if they don't give themselves enough, if they don't know about this as an opportunity and don't have enough timeline to learn about it and do the work, they run out of time of being able to consider employee ownership as a succession plan for them. And so raising awareness, and not only raising awareness with businesses and employees, but also with professional advisors. It's a full ecosystem. You need the professional advisors who are skilled in doing these transactions. You need the capital to help support it. And you need the business owners and the workers motivated to create a new kind of structure for themselves. So we were working with Project Equity and with different economic development folks around our community, and really trying to figure out how we create something that could help move this forward. And statewide center, there's others around the country. It seemed like the right model. And initially we were looking at having it be its own standalone 501c3. But we got to a point where, much as the earlier part of this conversation, it's like it's a lot of work to do that, and it takes the energy and the resources away from getting the work done. Our organization had the opportunity of a bequest that happened to come up, and our boss, the CEO of the foundation, was able to make the decision to put $500,000 towards a 3-year support of moving this work forward. So we are currently in a situation where we are not technically physically sponsoring because the center has not registered as a nonprofit, but we're incubating it. And we've hired a director for the center, which is Patricia, who's on this call and helped co-write this article. And she's technically a staff member of the Community Foundation, but she's the director of this statewide center. And so we're branded separately and all of that. So it's just been a really interesting journey to figure out what's the best way to lean in and support this work as a community foundation, engaging other community foundations around the state. We are going to need to raise funding to do the kind of work that we want to do. And in the middle of this process for us, our state actually, one of our more conservative state senators brought legislation to the Congress, and as Allison said, it passed quickly and unanimously in 2023. And so we now have a state program for employee ownership at our Department of Commerce. And so we're collaborating with them and looking at what can they do best to move this forward, and what can we do best to move this forward, and create just more employee ownership economy in our state. What was it, Allison, that you asked me to be sure to speak to?
The importance of you being rural, located
Oh,
rural,
yeah.
but serving the whole state.
Yeah, so some things about our state. The Seattle metropolitan area, most of the resources and things happen in that area, which is called King County predominantly. And then we have these Cascade Mountains that run north-south, and we have a very different kind of climate and sometimes political climate on the east side of the mountains and the west. And so there can be issues around getting statewide support for something that is where it's located matters, and Seattle gets just more of the resources than maybe the rest of us wish they would get. So we're in a rural county, but with a small city, and we're located outside. We're an hour and a half north. Like I said, we're up against the Canadian border, and it just it felt important to support this work outside of a major metropolitan area, and communicate that there's a lot of rural communities that are hugely impacted by the possibility of businesses closing, and how we can get that support and raise that awareness. And there's certain sectors that are more easily inclined to different employee ownership structures. And we're currently, working. We don't have a physical place, but the vision is that we will have staff around the state in little satellite kind of facilities and places where people can have an in-person relationship with somebody associated with the center, as well as, of course, we're in this world where we can do so much remotely in terms of webinars and education and web-based resources to support folks. Is there anything else, Patricia or Allison, that I should include in this? I think, and that I will just say the end of our article was just to invite everyone to consider in your community where you might have employee-owned businesses that you didn't recognize were there, and how you might look at what could happen in your community to raise awareness. And our idea is that eventually this as a structure is being taught at all levels of education, that kids in high school will be learning that employee ownership is an option for them as they think about what they're, because ideally you have people forming organizations as employee ownership, not transitioning necessarily, right? So, and of course, many cooperatives have been formed that way.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Alex. And you know, what I love about this article is, you know, the commitment really of community foundations to building institutions that are creating long-term wealth for the community. And this is just a living, breathing example of that. So thank you. So there are two additional articles in the issue. One is authored by Project Equity, and at the last minute, they were unable to join us today. But Project Equity is a national field building organization, and full disclosure, I'm one of the co-founders, but I definitely encourage you to pop into that article and read that. And then the last is one that I authored about Ownership Capital Lab, which is the organization that I have founded last year. And, you know, you've heard from these various different authors of the different parts and pieces, maybe the ingredients, if you will, of what it takes to create more employee ownership in a community. And one of the really important ingredients is capital. And, you know, for folks who don't live and breathe the world of buying and selling small businesses, which is most of us, you may not realize that the marketplace of buying and selling small businesses is really dominated by private equity. And private equity does what private equity does in order to maximize the return to their shareholders, their capital. And what they end up doing, and not in all cases, but in many cases, is taking the value out of that business and giving it to their capital holders. And you end up with businesses that are less strong, less resilient over the longer term, higher rates of bankruptcy, versus employee ownership, which, as we've heard, creates these vibrant businesses that are stronger. They outlast their competitors. They're great for their workers. They do all of these good things. They keep that company rooted locally, which in rural communities is especially important. But when you look at the amount of capital that we have to support the growth of employee ownership versus the amount of capital that, say, private equity has to support what they're doing, there's no comparison. We have relatively no capital. So that's not to say that the work of all of the organizations in the employee ownership space isn't really valuable and isn't creating a lot of important work to create new employee-owned companies. But when you compare the two, it's like a little and then a really big one. So that, in essence, is what led me to start Ownership Capital Lab. We are a fiscally sponsored nonprofit, but to really think about how do we use the lever of capital as a growth accelerator for employee ownership. And so the last article in the issue about Ownership Capital really delves into, well, what are the strategies that we might be able to use to accomplish that? And what are the types of things that a nonprofit field building organization can use in order to build the marketplace for a particular investment type? Some people may be familiar with the concept of climate investing, right? Investing for climate. So there's this concept in the investment space of investing in order to further a particular area of interest. There's also gender lens investing. Well, what we're working to do is to make ownership lens investing a thing where you are investing in order to help people, the average American household, have more assets on their balance sheet. And employee ownership is a great way to do that. So I will leave it at that in terms of the Ownership Capital Lab article, and turn it back over to you, Nick, to take us where we go from here.
Well, thanks, Allison, and thanks to all the authors. I think you said field building, right? Field building, and whether it's the fiscal sponsorship or field building, just by bringing you together and have this published and in place, and then hearing from them. So the next segment of this is you have two breakout groups. You can move into the and fiscal sponsorship with Thaddeus and have a conversation there, or ask the authors and Thaddeus questions, or you can pick the group with Allison on Ownership Capital Lab and really talk about employee ownership with them. You'll have about 20 minutes we're going to bring back, and then we'll turn it back to Allison and Thaddeus for sort of final commentary of what was brought up in those groups. So enjoy your breakout groups, and we'll see you in about 20 minutes. Thank you so much. Well, welcome back, everyone. I was part of the fiscal sponsorship side. So Thaddeus, as you grab your thoughts, maybe we can have Allison come back and give final thoughts on what you guys discussed and any final lessons that you thought this video will live online with the journal. So anything that you want the readership as they read the articles, those final sort of tidbits of information or key takeaways. Allison?
Sure. So we talked a lot about the different actors, if you will, and the need for an ecosystem focus. If you want to think about the whether it's employee ownership or some other sort of initiative that's going to create long-term, real life-changing impacts at the community level, it takes a village, right? So it's not something that one organization can do by themselves. It's not something that one actor type. And when I say actor, we heard from community foundations, we heard from community-based nonprofits, we heard from field builders, we heard from capital providers, technical assistance providers, business experts. So it takes a lot of different actors to make this come together in a way that works, that shouldn't make you shy away from saying, I want this in my community, because it really does create these life-changing impacts. We heard from Emma, the $10,000 a year check that goes into people's pockets. I've seen that in my own work at Project Equity. We've transitioned directly more than 25 companies, and I've seen those kinds of dollars end up in employees' pockets in the years when the company is still paying down their debt from that transition. So in the outer years, when they're not paying down the debt, those numbers should grow and grow. So I think the big takeaways are that employee ownership is something that every community wants more of, and that from wherever you sit in the nonprofit sector, you do have the opportunity to play a role in helping to grow it.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Back to you, Thaddeus, for final words or final thoughts.
Yeah, I just a question Nick asked in our section that we didn't really address head on in any of the articles, at least I don't believe, is really the question of path to scale for these programs. And we really see the most wieldy path to scale being the existing kind of nonprofit infrastructure that's out there. Specifically community foundations, which are public charities, and many of them are fiscal sponsors and DAF managers, DAF sponsors, but many more are sort of now considering fiscal sponsorship as a program area. Alliances and associations, of which there are thousands, serving every imaginable community and focus, as you all know. And Nick brought up CDFIs as a potential, because they are largely, if not exclusively, public charities, so that they could be fiscal sponsors. In our research, we found that most of the sponsors, at least the ones that we surveyed, do other things other than fiscal sponsorships. They have other programs and services they run, which really indicates that the existing nonprofit infrastructure is probably going to be our best way to proliferate this model. And so that's definitely our focus and where we see the field and ecosystem moving in the future.
So with that, we just want to thank you for taking the time to write these articles. Our theme-based editions is now there's a concentrated place where you can always refer to, and hopefully will help build the field and help you on those missions to expand that knowledge. And the readership of the journal continues to grow, both internationally and domestically in the United States. So we hope through all of our curation, our model is like having all these different groups come together. We're actually teaching and helping learn, across different sectors or so. But with that, this video will also live online with that. And so we're going to put these videos alongside those articles so people can, so you'll perpetually be online or whatever, so people hear from you about the original thoughts from that. So, but special thanks to Allison and Thaddeus for curating the two components of this edition. And thank you to all the authors. And the edition's published, so went out this morning to our readership, and we look forward to maybe a second version of this later on. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks to
Thank you
Social
all.
Innovation
Take
for
care, everyone.
hosting
you.
these articles.